So today I'm going to tell you a little story about my fourth child, my son Jason. And it's an up and down story, but you'll see that it does have a pretty good ending. It's not over yet, but this story will have a good ending. Okay, so let's get into it. Thanks for being here. This is my son Jason at nearly 1 year old. He's the youngest of my four children. My mom filmed him at her house as he spun in his sit and play. At this time, he wasn't crawling, standing, walking, or speaking. By 1996, he was diagnosed with infantile spasms and severe autism. I was unsure what the future held for Jason and for our family, but I was going to try to help him reach his highest level of ability, doing everything I could. Watching him spin in this thing, I can't believe how fast he used to go. It's pretty funny. This is my son Jason today. In fact, yesterday we went out to take some photos of the mountains around us. He's a typical 30-year-old in just about every way, but his speech is still at like a toddler level. We're still learning what he understands and what he's capable of, and each day is a new revelation. In early September of 1994, Jason was 4 months old, and I was starting to feed him infant cereal. And while sitting in his high chair one morning, his head suddenly dropped down as if he couldn't hold it up. After several times of doing this, I noticed that his fists were clenched and that he would cry afterward. I called the care provider, and they told us to bring him into urgent care. So I explained to the doctor once we got there what was going on, and he said it's probably an ear infection. They do look a little red, and he said I'll prescribe some antibiotics and he'll be fine. Trusting him because he's a doctor, I accepted that explanation, but something made me feel uneasy. So while waiting in the pharmacy, Jason began to start the clenching and head drop. I felt like it was a seizure. At that moment, the doctor came out of one of the clinic doors and I said, "Dr. Anderson, he's having an episode right now." To which the doctor replied, without even stopping to look at me, "Now, Mom, stop worrying. Just get him started on those antibiotics." So continuing the story, the next day, Jason had 2 or 3 more episodes and was crying as if he was in pain. This time, the episodes lasted about 20 minutes, and I called the clinic demanding to see a different doctor, not Dr. Anderson again. And I explained the condition, explained the seizures. A few hours later, we're sitting in the exam room, and the door opens, and this tiny little older lady comes in. She couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall, just a petite woman in a white lab coat, rocking when she walked. She was interesting. She kind of reminded me of the little psychic on the first, the medium on the first movie, The Poltergeist. She reminded me of her. Anyway, she smiled and introduced herself and then began to examine Jason. A few minutes later, he started to have an episode. So she said, "I think I know what this is." And then she asked me if I was breastfeeding, to which I answered yes. And then she picked up the phone and said to someone at the other end, "Please ready a room for mom and infant. They're on their way over." She smiled at me and patted my hand, and she told me that she was admitting us both into the hospital for testing and observation. She ordered an EEG and an MRI to check for any obvious injury or indications of something being wrong. And I was given a bed next to him, and there was a cozy recliner in the room, and he was in like this hospital crib, basically. And then they served me meals and checked in on me often. throughout the day and the next day. I didn't see Dr. Lem again after that, after we were admitted, but she was like an angel to me at that time. So the day after the EEG and MRI, this young male doctor came into the room, and he was accompanied by several interns. He picked up my son's chart and began to talk with me and looked at me without even looking at me, but he began to talk to me, and he said, the EEG shows seizure activity, but the MRI shows no indication of injury or malformation. So there was no indication of a problem other than the seizures, obviously. He said the diagnosis is infantile spasms. And with that, he handed me a piece of paper on which he had circled a small paragraph. And the paper looked like a copy of a copy of a copy that had been recopied several times over. It was all crooked and stuff and faded. And it was a copy of a page out of a medical journal, a medical book, like a book of diseases or something. I don't know. The paragraph was labeled infantile spasms, and it had, I don't know, maybe 10 sentences in it. Not a whole lot of information, basically the same thing that he told me was going on. And at that time, Jason's dad, my husband at the time, asked the doctor, well, what's the prognosis? And the doctor said, it's not good. Your son will most likely never speak, never feed himself, never tie his shoes, go to school. He'll probably need to be institutionalized when he's older. Well, obviously that was a little bit devastating. And later that day, I was crying while I'm trying to feed my son, and a woman walked into the room in a lab coat, and she introduced herself as Dr. Lou. I think it was Dr. Lou, a neurologist. And she put her hand on my shoulder and asked how I was doing. And I told her what the male doctor, the other doctor, had said, and how hopeless I felt. And she said, now you don't listen to him. She said, we're going to take this one step at a time. And there are many new therapies that are quite effective. And that made me feel a little bit better. It gave me some hope. So then we were given different medications, of course, to stop the seizures. And as the weeks passed, Jason slept like a newborn. So he was more asleep than awake, much like a newborn. And here he was a little over 4 months old. I'm still kind of a newborn, but still, he should have been awake more than that by this time. So even into 5-6 months, he still seemed to be just sleeping a whole lot. But it did stop the seizures, which was good. But he had stopped sitting up. He had stopped responding to us. And so even up to 1 year old, where you see him in the little spinning sit and play, even at that time, he was barely able to sit up by himself. He could, like for feeding and so on, if it was a supported area, but he still was unsteady even doing that basic thing. And he was still, looking at his fists, playing with his fists. So there was no awareness of anything outside of himself at that point. Because of his age and the lack of motor skill development, and he was hyperflexive, so he was overly flexible. And I think that probably has a lot to do, obviously, with not having the muscle tone to be able to do some of the things he should have been doing by 1 year, a little over one by that time. We were referred to an occupational therapist, and later an in-home therapeutic service program. And in that time, I started to kind of investigate his condition, the infantile spasms, and I learned a little bit more about autism because I had heard the word, and I had experienced a couple of students through the YMCA. When I was working there in the 80s, I experienced a couple of families that had children with autism, and at that time, it was a very scary thing. So though though a word had not been spoken, the A word had not been spoken by any doctor at that point, I had a feeling that it was relevant. There was something in me that told me. So one day I asked the therapist who was in our home doing different types of training with him and so on. And I asked her about it, and she looked at me and she goes, "Oh," and she said, "I'm so glad you asked me." She said, "I've been suspicious of that myself with Jason, but," she said, "I'm not allowed to mention it or to ask you about it or even suggest it. You have to ask me." So I'm like, well, how would a parent know, right? Anyway, so she referred me to a clinic in San Diego that would diagnose for autism. And so I went through their evaluation, and once he was diagnosed and everything was set in place, my son became a client of a government-funded support service. Inland Regional Center is what it's called in our area. And after that, we were flooded with all types of therapies and support. Now, mind you, this was in 1996, so Jason was 2 years old. Since then, a lot has changed. At that time, it was such kind of a new deal, really, with a name to it and a little more understanding about it, that the services were just plentiful. Since then, things have changed a little bit. But anyway, so meanwhile, I'm raising my 3 daughters too, and trying to run the business that my sister and I owned. And our business was, it's so fortunate what our business was. We owned a gymnastics and cheerleading training center. And so it was all about movement education. We did a lot of children's movement education classes and so on. And our kids, it was like a second home to them. They would go to the gym with us. So while we're teaching, they're in a room with toys and snacks we'd bring for them. And, we had an office manager at some point that was able to kind of let us know if anything was going on. And because of it being a family business, everybody worked together and they were used to it. Even future years with employees that had children, we all just kind of worked together to make it this environment where we could do what we needed to do, and our kids could be there to do their homework or do whatever they needed. It was a great thing, really. But as well as that, the sensory integration opportunities in gymnastics, dance, other similar types of activities are so good for motor skill development, cognitive development, just so many things. But sensory integration is what has been found to be absolutely necessary in kids with sensory disorders like autism or even ADHD, for example. We didn't know that for sure at the time. We just knew that the kids who came through our door who had either ADHD or other types of differently wired brains really thrived on jumping on a trampoline, swinging, music. And so as Jason came into this, we were able to just kind of incorporate him into some of those activities, and eventually realized how much it was helping. And then through research, found out that was what a lot of occupational therapy was about. And we found other professionals out there that were doing classes specifically for this. That was amazing to me. Just the synchronistic way it all came together. And Jason was just all the physical things that we weren't sure he'd ever be able to do. He went from not even being able to crawl at a year old to, by 2 years old, he went, well, at 2 years old, he still wasn't walking. He wasn't even standing up. But from the time we started doing these things in the gym with him, and he was in that sit and play that my mom bought him and that she filmed him in, those things, I believe, are what skyrocketed him back up to where he should have been, at least with physical locomotor abilities. Anyway, so he began standing and walking and all of that. And it was just that we were doing this by instinct with these children. And then when Jace came along, it was like it verified everything that we were doing. That was a really good feeling. So 30 years later, we're still learning and growing along with Jason. He's a blessing to our family. He's led us down some amazing roads, influencing much of our life's path. So this story really is just about, as parents or just people in general, to always look on the side of what's possible and follow your gut. Obviously, we're gonna nurture when necessary and when appropriate. We're gonna be firm and logical when appropriate. That's what balance is about. And balance in my life has been, instead of being a victim and just withering away when we were given this diagnosis, we looked at what can we do. And it was just go on with life. Jace, you're part of our family, and I know that your condition means you don't like loud noises, you don't like changes, you don't like bright lights, you don't like this, you don't like that. He had no choice but to go along with us. I was a single mom in most of this time. And so it was a matter of he just had to fit in with what the rest of the kids were doing and what our family did. There was no time to be too sensitive to what he needed. Obviously, we were to a certain extent, but I'm just saying, I think him having to adapt really did make a difference in his development. And so while our life was chaotic, not balanced in any means in that way, our approach was balanced. And I refuse to feel like a victim in this. And I hope some of you kind of will take the subtle reference to lemons and lemonade and understand why I threw that video and part in there. So go into each day knowing that life can surprise us, but our perspective is the key to navigating smoothly. There's a time for firm logic and a time for nurturing hope. And so it is. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.